Picture this: a 17-year-old boy from the rugged mountains of Macedonia arrives at the gates of Athens, carrying nothing but his inheritance and an insatiable hunger for knowledge. The year is 367 BC. The city buzzes with philosophical debate, political intrigue, and intellectual ferment. This young man has travelled hundreds of miles from his homeland to study under the greatest mind of his generation. His name is Aristotle, and he has no idea that he is about to reshape human understanding forever. What drives a teenager to abandon everything familiar and journey to a foreign city in pursuit of wisdom? What transforms a curious student into the teacher of Alexander the Great, the founder of logic and the architect of Western thought? The story of Aristotle is not just the biography of one man, it is the chronicle of how a single mind can illuminate the darkest corners of human ignorance and lay the foundation for everything we know about science, ethics, politics, and the very nature of existence itself. But here is what makes this story truly extraordinary. Aristotle did not simply absorb the teachings of his master, Plato. He questioned them, challenged them, and ultimately revolutionized them. Where Plato looked upward to eternal forms in a transcendent realm, Aristotle looked downward to the living, breathing world around us. Where Plato sought perfect ideals beyond the physical universe, Aristotle found truth in the messy, complex, ever-changing reality we actually inhabit. By the time you finish this journey through Aristotle's life, you will understand not just who he was, but how his ideas continue to shape every aspect of our modern world. From the scientific method to democratic government, from the way we categorize knowledge to how we think about friendship and happiness, Aristotle's fingerprints are everywhere. And it all began with that teenage boy walking through the gates of Athens, ready to learn everything there was to know. Before we dive into this incredible story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you might imagine, and I am genuinely curious where in the world you're joining me tonight. Let me know in the comments. Now, let us travel back 24 centuries to witness the birth of a mind that would change everything. Aristotle was born in 384 BC in Stagira, a small Greek colonial city perched on the Chalcidice Peninsula in northern Macedonia. This was not the sophisticated Athens of Pericles or the military might of Sparta. This was frontier territory, a place where Greek culture met the broader Macedonian world. The timing of his birth was perfect, arriving during what historians call the golden age of Greek philosophy, when human reason was being applied to every conceivable question about existence, knowledge, and the good life. His father, Nicomachus, was no ordinary provincial doctor. He served as the personal physician to Amyntas III, the king of Macedonia and grandfather of the future Alexander the Great. This connection to the Macedonian royal court would prove crucial throughout Aristotle's life, opening doors and creating opportunities that shaped his destiny. But more importantly, growing up in a physician's household exposed young Aristotle to the systematic study of the natural world in ways that would profoundly influence his later philosophical method. Imagine watching your father dissect cadavers, catalogue symptoms, and prescribe treatments based on careful observation rather than superstition or tradition. While other children learned through stories and myths, Aristotle learned to look closely at the physical world, to notice patterns, to ask questions about cause and effect. His father taught him that understanding comes not from accepting what others tell you, but from examining evidence with your own eyes and reasoning through problems step by step. The influence of this medical background cannot be overstated. Where Plato would later teach that the physical world is merely shadows on a cave wall, Aristotle had been trained since childhood to see the physical world as the source of genuine knowledge. Where other philosophers dismissed the body as a prison for the soul, Aristotle had watched his father heal bodies and understood their intricate beauty and complexity. But tragedy struck early. Both of Aristotle's parents died when he was still a boy, leaving him an orphan in his early teens. This loss could have derailed his education entirely, but fortune intervened in the form of Proxenus, who became his guardian. Proxenus was not just a relative taking in an orphan child. He was an educated man who recognized the brilliant potential in young Aristotle and made a decision that would change the course of human history. Rather than keeping the boy in provincial Stagira to learn a trade or manage the family property, Proxenus sent him to Athens to receive the finest education available in the Greek world. The Athens that 17-year-old Aristotle entered in 367 BC was a city in transition. The glory days of the Athenian Empire were over. The devastating Peloponnesian War had ended decades earlier, with Athens defeated and humiliated. Democracy had been temporarily overthrown by the 30 tyrants, then restored, then shaken by continued political instability. The city that had once ruled the Aegean was now just another Greek city-state, struggling to find its place in a changing world. Yet Athens remained the intellectual capital of the Greek world. The agora buzzed with philosophical debate. The academy, founded by Plato 20 years earlier, had become the premier institution of higher learning. Sophists still taught rhetoric and public speaking to ambitious young men seeking political careers. The theatre continued to produce the great tragedies and comedies that explored the deepest questions of human existence. For a brilliant young man hungry for knowledge, there was simply no better place to be. The academy that Aristotle entered was unlike any educational institution that had ever existed. Located in a sacred grove about a mile northwest of Athens, it was part school, part research institute, and part religious community. Students came from across the Mediterranean world to study mathematics, astronomy, dialectic, and philosophy under Plato's guidance. The curriculum was rigorous and comprehensive, designed not to prepare students for specific careers, but to train their minds to think clearly about the most fundamental questions human beings could ask. According to tradition, an inscription over the entrance read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." This was not mere intellectual snobbery. Plato believed that mathematics was the gateway to philosophy because it trained the mind to think about eternal, unchanging truths, rather than the shifting, deceptive world of sensory experience. Only after mastering geometry and arithmetic could a student move on to the higher reaches of philosophical contemplation. Plato himself was now 60 years old, at the height of his intellectual powers, and already recognized as one of the greatest philosophers who had ever lived. He had spent decades developing his theory of forms, his vision of an ideal republic, and his understanding of the soul's immortal nature. Students flocked to hear him lecture and to participate in the dialectical conversations that were the heart of academy life. The young Aristotle was immediately recognized as exceptional. Plato reportedly called him the mind, in recognition of his intellectual sharpness and analytical ability. But Plato also supposedly nicknamed him the foal, a reference to a young horse that kicks, suggesting that this brilliant student would not simply absorb doctrine, but would challenge and question everything he was taught. This playful nickname would prove prophetic in ways Plato could never have imagined. The academy's daily routine shaped Aristotle's intellectual development in profound ways. Mornings were spent in lectures, where Plato would explore the deepest questions of metaphysics, ethics, and political philosophy. Afternoons were devoted to mathematical studies and dialectical practice. Evenings brought informal conversations in the gardens, where students and teachers debated the ideas they had encountered during the day. It was an environment of intense intellectual stimulation, where every assumption could be questioned and every argument had to be defended through rigorous reasoning. But Aristotle was not content to simply master the existing curriculum. From the beginning, his interests ranged far beyond what the academy typically taught. While other students focused on mathematics and metaphysics, Aristotle became fascinated by the natural world in ways that reflected his medical upbringing. He collected specimens, studied animal behavior, and began developing systematic approaches to understanding biological processes. This empirical bent set him apart from his fellow students. The Academy's orientation was fundamentally mathematical and abstract. Plato taught that genuine knowledge concerned eternal perfect forms that existed beyond the physical world. The realm of becoming, the world of plants and animals and changing things, was considered a realm of mere opinion, not true knowledge. But Aristotle could not shake his conviction that careful observation of particular things could yield genuine insights about universal principles. The tension between teacher and student began early, though it would take years to fully develop. Aristotle had enormous respect for Plato's genius and devoted himself to mastering Platonic philosophy. His earliest writings, now lost, were dialogues written in imitation of Plato's style. He accepted many core Platonic doctrines, including the immortality of the soul and the importance of virtue for human flourishing. But even as a young student, Aristotle was developing insights that would eventually lead him to reject some of his teacher's most fundamental ideas. What made the Academy so extraordinary was not just the quality of instruction, but the community of brilliant minds that gathered there. Aristotle found himself surrounded by some of the most talented young intellectuals of his generation. There was Speusippus, Plato's nephew, who would eventually succeed his uncle as head of the Academy. There was Xenocrates, who combined mathematical precision with mystical insight. There were students from Syracuse, from the cities of Asia Minor, from the islands of the Aegean, all drawn to Athens by the Academy's reputation. These were not passive students sitting in lectures and taking notes. The Academy encouraged debate, disagreement, and intellectual exploration. Students were expected to develop their own ideas, to push beyond what their teachers had taught them, to make original contributions to human knowledge. It was in this environment of rigorous intellectual freedom that Aristotle began to develop the distinctive approach to philosophy that would eventually make him one of the most influential thinkers in human history. Years passed. Aristotle mastered the Academy's curriculum and became one of Plato's most trusted associates. He was no longer just a student but a teacher himself, leading discussions and mentoring younger pupils. His reputation for brilliance spread throughout the intellectual community of Athens. But beneath the surface, fundamental disagreements with Platonic orthodoxy were growing. The young man who had arrived as an eager 17-year-old was becoming an independent philosopher with his own vision of how human knowledge should be pursued. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. Where Plato emphasized the eternal and unchanging, Aristotle became increasingly fascinated by change, growth, and development. Where Plato looked for perfect mathematical relationships, Aristotle studied the messy complexity of biological processes. Where Plato sought to escape the world of appearances and ascend to pure reason, Aristotle wanted to understand how reason could make sense of the world we actually experience through our senses. For 20 years, Aristotle remained at the Academy, learning, teaching, and slowly developing the philosophical system that would revolutionize human thought. But forces beyond the philosophical were at work. Political tensions between Athens and Macedonia were growing. Plato was aging, and questions about the Academy's future leadership were becoming pressing. And in the northern kingdom of Macedonia, a young prince named Alexander was approaching the age when he would need the finest education available in the Greek world. The stage was being set for the next phase of Aristotle's extraordinary journey, when the provincial doctor's son would become tutor to the future conqueror of the world. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle during these 2 decades was complex. evolving from simple teacher-student to something more like intellectual, equals engaged in profound philosophical dialogue. As Aristotle matured, he began to voice disagreements that went to the very heart of Platonic philosophy. These were not the rebellious challenges of a young student trying to make his mark, but the carefully reasoned objections of a brilliant mind that had fully grasped his teacher's system and found it wanting. The most fundamental disagreement concerned the nature of reality itself. Plato's theory of forms posited that true reality consisted of perfect, eternal archetypes existing in a transcendent realm beyond the physical world. Everything we see and touch, according to this view, is merely an imperfect copy of these perfect forms. The form of horse exists eternally and perfectly, while individual horses are pale shadows that participate in this ideal but never fully embody it. Aristotle found this explanation both unnecessary and problematic. His medical background had taught him to trust careful observation, and his observations convinced him that individual things were not pale copies of perfect templates, but were real in their own right. When he studied a particular horse, he was not seeing a shadow of some perfect horse existing elsewhere. He was seeing a genuine substance with its own nature, its own principles of growth and development, its own reality. This led Aristotle to develop what would become one of his most revolutionary insights. Instead of looking beyond the physical world for explanations, he looked within it. The essence of horseness was not located in some separate realm of forms. It was embedded in individual horses themselves, in their structure, their behavior, their biological processes. Universal concepts like horse or justice or beauty were not independent entities, but were patterns that the mind could abstract from careful study of particular things. The implications of this shift were enormous. If Aristotle was right, then the path to knowledge did not require turning away from the sensible world toward pure reason and mathematics. Instead, it required turning toward the world with better tools for observation and analysis. The senses, which Plato had dismissed as sources of mere opinion, became for Aristotle the starting point for genuine knowledge. This empirical orientation led Aristotle to develop methodologies that were revolutionary for their time. While other philosophers relied primarily on logical argument and mathematical demonstration, Aristotle began to emphasize systematic observation, careful classification, and what we would now recognize as early forms of scientific method. He collected specimens, conducted dissections, interviewed experts, and accumulated vast amounts of data about the natural world. His approach to biology exemplified this new methodology. Rather than beginning with abstract principles about what life must be like, Aristotle began by studying living things as they actually existed. He examined hundreds of different animal species, cataloguing their anatomy, their behavior, their reproduction, their development from embryo to adult. He discovered that dolphins were mammals, not fish. He documented the complex social structures of bees. He traced the development of chick embryos day by day, creating the first systematic embryology. This work was not just descriptive, but theoretical. Aristotle was developing a new understanding of what it meant to explain natural phenomena. Instead of appealing to mathematical relationships or transcendent forms, he focused on what he called the four causes. To truly understand anything, you needed to know its material cause, what it was made of, its formal cause, what kind of thing it was, its efficient cause, what brought it into being, and its final cause, what purpose or goal it served. This framework allowed Aristotle to make sense of change and development in ways that Platonic philosophy could not. A seed becoming a tree was not a pale copy trying to approximate some perfect tree existing elsewhere. It was a substance actualizing its own internal potential, guided by its own nature toward its own natural end. Change was not movement away from perfection, but the fulfillment of inherent possibilities. The Academy community watched these developments with fascination and growing concern. Here was Plato's most brilliant student, systematically dismantling key elements of Platonic doctrine. The debates between teacher and student must have been intense, carried out in the garden paths where Plato had walked for decades, surrounded by students who were witnessing the birth of a new philosophical approach. Yet despite their fundamental disagreements, the relationship between Plato and Aristotle remained respectful and even affectionate. Aristotle later wrote that Plato was a man whom it would be impious for bad men even to praise, and who first showed clearly, both in his life and in his methods of reasoning, how to be good and happy at the same time. Even as he rejected the theory of forms, Aristotle never forgot his debt to the teacher, who had trained his mind and shaped his character. The tension came to a head in 347 BC, when Plato died at the age of 80. The question of succession at the Academy became pressing, and many assumed that Aristotle, as the most brilliant of Plato's students, would naturally become the new head of the school. But the choice fell instead to Speusippus, Plato's nephew. Whether this decision was based on family loyalty, political considerations, or genuine philosophical disagreements about the direction the Academy should take, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that Aristotle chose not to remain at the Academy under Speusippus's leadership. Perhaps he felt that his philosophical views had diverged too far from Platonic orthodoxy. Perhaps he sensed that Athens was becoming increasingly hostile to Macedonians as tensions between the city-states grew. Or perhaps he simply felt ready to establish his own philosophical school based on his own distinctive approach to knowledge. Whatever the reasons, Aristotle left Athens in 347 BC, beginning a period of travel and exploration that would further develop his empirical methodology and bring him into contact with new intellectual influences. His first destination was Assos, a Greek city on the coast of Asia Minor, where he had been invited by Hermias, the ruler of the territory and a former fellow student at the Academy. Hermias was an unusual figure, a eunuch who had risen from slavery to become the tyrant of Assos and the surrounding region. But he was also a philosopher, deeply influenced by Platonic ideals about the possibility of rule by wisdom rather than mere force. He had gathered around him a circle of philosophers and was attempting to put philosophical principles into practice in his governance. For Aristotle, this was an opportunity to observe firsthand how philosophical theory might be applied to political reality. The 3 years Aristotle spent in Assos were formative in ways that went beyond philosophy. He married Pythias, either the daughter or niece of Hermias, a union that brought him both personal happiness and political connections. He also continued his biological research, taking advantage of the rich marine life along the Asia Minor coast to extend his studies of animal behavior and development. But the political situation in the region was precarious. The Persian Empire, under its energetic king Artaxerxes III, was reasserting control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Hermias found himself caught between his loyalty to Greek independence and the overwhelming military power of Persia. When he was eventually captured by Persian forces and executed for his resistance, Aristotle found himself in a dangerous position as a known associate of a man the Persians considered a traitor. Once again, Aristotle was forced to leave a place that had become home. He fled to the island of Lesbos, where he was welcomed by Theophrastus, another former student of the Academy who would become his closest collaborator and eventual successor. Lesbos provided a perfect environment for Aristotle to continue his biological research. The island's diverse ecosystems, from coastal waters rich with marine life to inland forests and mountains, offered an extraordinary natural laboratory. It was on Lesbos that Aristotle conducted some of his most detailed biological investigations. He studied the reproductive cycles of various fish species, documented the complex life histories of different marine invertebrates, and made detailed observations of bird migration patterns. His work was so thorough and accurate that modern biologists still refer to his descriptions when studying certain species. But Aristotle's interests extended far beyond biology. During his years away from Athens, he was also developing his ideas about ethics, politics, logic, and metaphysics. The systematic approach he applied to the study of animals, he began to apply to every domain of human experience. Just as he had classified different species according to their essential characteristics, he began to classify different types of human knowledge, different forms of government, different kinds of friendship, different varieties of logical argument. This encyclopedic ambition was unprecedented in the history of philosophy. Previous thinkers had typically focused on particular areas of inquiry. The pre-Socratics had concentrated on cosmology and natural philosophy. Socrates had turned philosophy toward ethical questions. Plato had developed a comprehensive system, but one that was fundamentally unified around the theory of forms. Aristotle was attempting something different, a systematic investigation of every aspect of reality using empirical methods and logical analysis. The scope of his interests was breathtaking. He studied meteorology and astronomy, developing theories about the formation of comets and the causes of earthquakes. He analysed different forms of poetry and drama, creating the first systematic literary criticism. He investigated the nature of memory and dreams, the causes of sleep, the mechanisms of perception. He examined different types of friendship and love, different forms of courage and justice, different varieties of political constitution. Each investigation was conducted with the same methodical approach. Begin with careful observation of the phenomena. Collect and analyze the opinions of previous thinkers. Identify the key problems and contradictions that need to be resolved. Develop definitions and classifications that capture the essential features of what is being studied. Construct logical arguments that move from secure premises to reliable conclusions. Test the results against further observation and experience. This methodology would eventually revolutionize human knowledge, but it was still developing during Aristotle's years of travel and research. The full flowering of his system would come later, when he returned to Athens and established his own school. But the foundations were being laid during these years of exile and exploration, as he learned to apply systematic rational inquiry to every domain of human experience. Meanwhile, events in the wider Greek world were moving toward a transformation that would reshape the entire Mediterranean region. In Macedonia, King Philip II was building the most effective military machine the world had ever seen. His innovations in tactics, siege warfare, and military organization were allowing him to dominate Greek politics in ways that no previous Macedonian ruler had managed. City-states that had maintained their independence for centuries were being forced to acknowledge Macedonian hegemony. And Philip's son Alexander was approaching adulthood. Born in 356 BC, the young prince was already showing signs of the extraordinary intelligence and ambition that would make him one of history's most remarkable figures. But his education had been entrusted to various tutors whose abilities Philip found inadequate for a future king who might rule over vast territories and diverse peoples. Philip needed someone who could provide Alexander with the finest education available in the Greek world. Someone who understood not just philosophy and mathematics, but also biology, politics, ethics, and the practical arts of governance. Someone who combined theoretical knowledge with practical experience, scholarly depth with worldly sophistication. In 343 BC, he made a decision that would bring together two of history's most extraordinary minds. He summoned Aristotle to become tutor to the future Alexander the Great. The invitation from Philip II arrived at a moment when Aristotle's life had reached a crossroads. He was 41 years old, no longer the eager student who had first walked through the academy's gates, but not yet the established master he would become. His years of research and travel had given him unprecedented knowledge of the natural world and a revolutionary approach to philosophical inquiry. Yet he remained intellectually homeless, cut off from the academy where he had spent his formative decades, uncertain about where his investigations would lead him next. Philip's offer was extraordinary in its scope and implications. The Macedonian king was not simply seeking a conventional tutor to teach his son rhetoric and mathematics. He wanted someone who could prepare Alexander for a destiny that Philip himself was only beginning to envision. Macedonia was poised to dominate the Greek world, and beyond Greece lay the vast Persian Empire, ripe for conquest. The education of the future king needed to match the magnitude of the opportunities that lay ahead. For Aristotle, the invitation represented both an incredible opportunity and a significant risk. Accepting would mean returning to Macedonia, the land of his birth, but also a kingdom viewed with suspicion and hostility by many Greeks. It would mean abandoning his research projects and taking on responsibilities that might consume years of his life. But it would also mean access to resources and influence that no philosopher had ever enjoyed. And it would mean the chance to test his ideas about ethics and politics in the most practical way possible, by shaping the mind of someone who might rule the world. The decision to accept reveals something fundamental about Aristotle's character and intellectual ambitions. Unlike Plato, who had retreated from political engagement after his disastrous experiences in Syracuse, Aristotle believed that philosophical wisdom should engage with practical reality. His biological research had taught him that understanding required not just theoretical analysis, but careful observation of how things actually functioned in the real world. Now he had the opportunity to observe and influence the development of a future ruler from the closest possible vantage point. The arrangement Philip proposed was generous beyond anything Aristotle could have expected. The philosopher would be provided with a staff of assistants and access to the royal library. More remarkably, Philip promised to rebuild Stagira, Aristotle's hometown, which had been destroyed during earlier military campaigns. The citizens who had been sold into slavery would be freed and allowed to return. It was an offer that combined professional opportunity with personal vindication in ways that must have seemed almost too good to be true. In 343 BC, Aristotle travelled north to Pella, the capital of Macedonia, to begin what would become one of the most famous teacher-student relationships in history. The Macedonia he encountered was a kingdom in the midst of extraordinary transformation. Under Philip's leadership, it had evolved from a backward mountain principality into the most powerful military force in the Greek world. The court at Pella buzzed with activity as diplomats, generals, and administrators managed the complex business of expansion and consolidation. Alexander was 13 years old when Aristotle arrived, already showing signs of the remarkable intelligence and fierce ambition that would define his adult life. He was physically small but intensely energetic, with the piercing gaze and quick movements that would later intimidate kings and generals. His mother, Olympias, had filled his childhood with stories of heroic ancestors and divine destiny. His father had begun his military education, teaching him tactics and strategy. But his intellectual development had been left to a series of tutors whose abilities had not satisfied Philip's grand ambitions for his heir. The relationship between the middle-aged philosopher and the teenage prince began cautiously. Aristotle was dealing with a student unlike any he had encountered at the academy. Alexander was brilliant, but his intelligence was restless and impatient. He absorbed information quickly, but became bored with abstract speculation that seemed disconnected from practical application. He had been raised to rule, and everything he learned needed to be evaluated in terms of how it might help him achieve dominance over other men. Aristotle adapted his teaching methods to match his extraordinary pupil. Rather than beginning with mathematics and dialectic, as the academy curriculum required, he started with subjects that would capture Alexander's imagination and serve his future needs. They studied Homer together, with Aristotle creating a special annotated edition of the Iliad that Alexander would carry with him throughout his later campaigns. The epic poems were not just literature, but guides to leadership, courage, and the complex psychology of command. The curriculum Aristotle developed for Alexander was unprecedented in its breadth and practical focus. They studied geography and ethnography, learning about the peoples and territories that might someday be subject to Macedonian rule. They examined different forms of government, analysing the strengths and weaknesses of various constitutional arrangements. They explored medicine and biology, knowledge that would prove invaluable for maintaining the health of armies in distant climates. They investigated rhetoric and diplomacy, arts essential for managing diverse populations and competing elites. But perhaps most importantly, they explored ethics and the nature of human excellence. Aristotle was developing ideas about virtue and character that would eventually be refined in his Nicomachean Ethics, and Alexander became the laboratory for testing these concepts. What qualities make a great leader? How should power be exercised? What is the relationship between personal virtue and political success? These were not abstract philosophical questions, but urgent practical problems that Alexander would soon face on a scale no previous ruler had ever encountered. The teaching took place not in formal classrooms, but in the gardens and walkways of a specially constructed facility at Miesa, a small town in the foothills of Mount Bermion. The setting was deliberately designed to encourage the kind of peripatetic discussion that Aristotle had learned to value during his years at the academy. Teacher and student would walk together for hours, examining specimens, debating questions, testing ideas against experience and observation. Other young Macedonian nobles joined these educational sessions, creating a small community of future leaders who would eventually help Alexander conquer and govern his vast empire. Among them were Hephaestion, who would become Alexander's closest friend and most trusted general, and Ptolemy, who would eventually rule Egypt as one of the successor kingdoms. These young men absorbed not just specific knowledge, but a way of thinking about problems that combined theoretical sophistication with practical application. The influence flowed in both directions. While Aristotle was shaping Alexander's intellectual development, the experience of teaching a future conqueror was also transforming Aristotle's own philosophical outlook. His ethical and political theories were being tested against the realities of power in ways that purely academic speculation could never achieve. His understanding of human nature was being refined through close observation of exceptional individuals operating under extraordinary pressures. The relationship was not without tensions. Alexander's temperament was fundamentally different from the contemplative ideal that Aristotle admired. The prince was driven by ambition for glory and conquest that sometimes conflicted with the philosopher's emphasis on moderation and rational reflection. Alexander wanted to surpass the heroes of legend, to achieve immortal fame through unprecedented accomplishments. Aristotle valued the quiet satisfaction of understanding truth for its own sake. These differences would become more pronounced as Alexander matured and began to assert his independence. But during the early years of their association, the collaboration was remarkably productive. Aristotle was learning to communicate complex philosophical ideas in ways that could guide practical decision-making. Alexander was developing intellectual habits and analytical skills that would serve him well when he inherited the most challenging political and military responsibilities of his age. The education extended far beyond formal lessons. Aristotle encouraged Alexander to collect specimens and artifacts from distant regions. laying the foundation for what would become the first systematic program of scientific exploration in European history. When Alexander later conquered Asia, he would send back to his former tutor detailed reports on the flora, fauna, geography, and customs of the territories he encountered. This collaboration between philosopher and conqueror would produce the most comprehensive body of empirical knowledge about the natural world that had ever been assembled. The political dimensions of the relationship were equally important. Through his connection to Alexander, Aristotle gained insights into the practical challenges of governance that would inform his later writings on politics and constitutional theory. He observed how different personality types responded to authority, how competing interests could be balanced, how loyalty could be maintained across cultural and linguistic barriers. These observations would eventually be systematized in his Politics, one of the most influential works ever written on the art of government. But the arrangement also placed Aristotle in an increasingly precarious position as tensions between Macedonia and the other Greek city-states continued to escalate. Many Athenians viewed him as a traitor who had sold his philosophical integrity for royal patronage. His association with the Macedonian court made him suspect in the eyes of those who saw Philip's expansion as a threat to Greek independence and democratic institutions. The situation became more complex as Alexander began to demonstrate the military genius that would make him one of history's most successful conquerors. In 340 BC, when he was only 16 years old, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia while Philip campaigned elsewhere. When a Thracian tribe rebelled, Alexander led the campaign that suppressed the revolt and founded his first city, naming it Alexandropolis. The student was beginning to surpass expectations in ways that must have both thrilled and concerned his philosophical mentor. The formal tutorial relationship lasted only 3 years, but its impact on both participants would endure for the rest of their lives. By 340 BC, Alexander had absorbed what Aristotle could teach him and was ready to begin the military and political career that would transform the ancient world. Aristotle, meanwhile, had gained experiences and insights that would inform the systematic philosophical works he would soon begin composing. The parting was amicable, marked by mutual respect and genuine affection. Alexander had developed a lifelong appreciation for learning and intellectual inquiry that would manifest itself in his support for scholars and scientists throughout his later conquests. Aristotle had gained a deeper understanding of how philosophical principles could be applied to the complex realities of political leadership. But their paths were diverging in ways that reflected fundamental differences in temperament and aspiration. Alexander was drawn toward the pursuit of glory through military conquest and empire building. Aristotle was increasingly committed to the systematic investigation of truth through careful observation and logical analysis. The former student would spend the next 13 years conquering most of the known world. The former teacher would spend his remaining years creating the intellectual framework that would guide human inquiry for the next 2 millennia. The relationship would face severe strains in the years ahead, as Alexander's methods of rule began to conflict with the ethical principles Aristotle had tried to instill. But the foundation of mutual respect and intellectual collaboration established during those 3 years at Mysa would influence both men for the rest of their lives. Alexander would carry Aristotle's annotated Iliad with him to the ends of the earth. Aristotle would draw on his observations of Alexander's character and career in developing his theories about the nature of political leadership and moral excellence. In 336 BC, Philip II was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, and 20-year-old Alexander inherited the throne of Macedonia and the leadership of the Greek coalition Philip had assembled. The young king moved quickly to consolidate his power, suppress rebellions, and prepare for the invasion of the Persian Empire that his father had planned. The greatest military adventure in ancient history was about to begin. For Aristotle, Philip's death marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. His royal patron was gone, and his former student was now embarked on a career that would take him far from the intellectual concerns they had shared. The philosopher was 58 years old, at the height of his intellectual powers, ready to undertake the systematic presentation of the revolutionary ideas he had been developing for decades. It was time to return to Athens and establish the school that would become his lasting monument to human reason and inquiry. In 335 BC, Aristotle made the decision that would define the final phase of his extraordinary career. At 59 years old, with decades of research behind him and revolutionary ideas demanding systematic presentation, he returned to Athens to establish his own school. The city he encountered was vastly different from the one he had left as a young man nearly 30 years earlier. Athens was no longer the confident imperial power of his youth, but it remained the intellectual heart of the Greek world, the place where serious philosophical work commanded respect and attracted the brightest minds. The location Aristotle chose for his school was perfect for his purposes. Just outside the city walls, adjacent to a gymnasium dedicated to Apollo Lysias, lay a grove of trees and covered walkways, ideal for the kind of peripatetic teaching he had practiced with Alexander. The Lyceum, as it came to be known, would become more than just a school. It would evolve into the world's first comprehensive research institution, a place where systematic investigation of every domain of human knowledge would be pursued with unprecedented rigor and scope. The contrast with Plato's academy was deliberate and profound. Where the academy had focused primarily on mathematics and abstract philosophical speculation, the Lyceum would embrace empirical investigation of the natural world. Where Plato had looked beyond the physical realm for ultimate truth, Aristotle would find reality in the careful study of particular things as they actually existed. Where the academy had attracted students seeking to escape the world of appearances, the Lyceum would draw those eager to understand that world more deeply. The physical layout of the school reflected these philosophical differences. The academy had been designed around gardens and quiet spaces conducive to contemplation and mathematical study. The Lyceum included laboratories for dissection and specimen collection, libraries for the systematic organization of knowledge, and museums displaying the artifacts and natural specimens that poured in from across the Mediterranean world. This was not just a place for thinking about reality, but for investigating it through direct observation and analysis. Aristotle's teaching method was as revolutionary as his curriculum. Rather than the formal lectures that characterized most educational institutions, he preferred to conduct his most important discussions while walking with his students along the covered pathways of the school. This peripatetic approach, from the Greek word for walking around, encouraged the kind of dynamic exchange of ideas that had characterized his own education and his work with Alexander. Knowledge was not something to be passively received, but actively pursued through questioning, debate, and collaborative investigation. The students who flocked to the Lyceum came from across the Greek world and beyond, drawn by Aristotle's growing reputation as the most learned man of his age. Unlike the academy, which had maintained a certain aristocratic exclusivity, the Lyceum was open to anyone with genuine intellectual curiosity and the ability to contribute to its research projects. Some students came for brief periods to study specific subjects. Others, like Theophrastus, would spend decades there and eventually inherit the leadership of the institution. The scope of investigation at the Lyceum was breathtaking in its ambition. Aristotle had conceived nothing less than a systematic classification and analysis of all human knowledge. He divided this vast enterprise into three main categories: each requiring its own methods and approaches. Theoretical sciences, including mathematics, physics, and what he called first philosophy or metaphysics, aimed at understanding reality for its own sake. Practical sciences, including ethics and politics, focused on how human beings should live and organize their communities. Productive sciences, including rhetoric, poetry, and the various crafts, concerned the creation of useful or beautiful objects. Within each category, Aristotle and his collaborators pursued investigations with a thoroughness that had never been attempted before. In biology, they collected and classified hundreds of species, conducted systematic dissections, and developed theories of reproduction and development that would remain authoritative for centuries. In physics, they analysed motion, change, and the fundamental constituents of matter. In psychology, they explored the nature of perception, memory, and thought. In ethics, they examined the conditions for human flourishing and the nature of virtue. In politics, they studied the constitutions of over 150 different city-states, analysing what made governments stable or unstable, just or unjust. The research was not conducted in isolation, but as part of a collaborative enterprise that anticipated the methods of modern scientific institutions. Students and colleagues were assigned specific projects that contributed to larger investigations. Reports were shared, critiqued, and refined through collective discussion. The library accumulated not just books but detailed records of observations, interviews with experts, and comparative analyses of different approaches to common problems. Central to all this activity was Aristotle's conviction that genuine knowledge required both empirical investigation and logical analysis. It was not enough to collect facts about the natural world. Those facts needed to be organised according to rational principles that revealed the underlying patterns and connections that made sense of apparent diversity and change. Similarly, logical reasoning could not proceed in isolation from careful observation of how things actually behaved in the world. This synthesis of empirical and rational methods led to some of Aristotle's most important innovations. In logic, he developed the first systematic analysis of valid reasoning, creating the framework of syllogistic argument that would dominate Western thought for over 2 millennia. A syllogism begins with general premises and derives specific conclusions through rules that guarantee the truth of the result if the premises are correct. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. This simple example illustrates the power of a method that could be applied to any domain of inquiry where reliable conclusions needed to be drawn from available evidence. But Aristotle's logic was not merely abstract. It was designed to serve the practical needs of investigation in fields like biology, politics, and ethics, where the goal was to move from particular observations to general principles that could guide further research and practical decision-making. When he studied different species of animals, he was not just collecting interesting facts, but developing classifications that revealed the essential characteristics that define different types of living things. When he analysed different forms of government, he was not just describing political arrangements, but identifying the principles that made some constitutions more successful than others. The biological research conducted at the Lyceum exemplifies the revolutionary character of Aristotle's approach to knowledge. Previous thinkers had typically relied on general principles or traditional beliefs when discussing living things. Aristotle insisted that understanding required direct investigation of particular organisms in their natural environments. He and his students dissected hundreds of different species, documenting their internal structures, reproductive processes, and behavioural patterns with unprecedented precision. The results were extraordinary. Aristotle correctly identified the mammalian nature of dolphins and whales at a time when most people classified them as fish. He provided detailed descriptions of the reproductive cycle of sharks, including the discovery that some species give birth to live young rather than laying eggs. He documented the complex social organization of bee colonies, recognizing the central role of what he called the king bee, actually the queen, in maintaining the unity of the hive. More importantly, these particular observations led to general theories about the nature of life that would influence biological thinking for centuries. Aristotle developed the first systematic classification of living things, organizing them into a hierarchy that moved from the simplest forms to the most complex. He formulated principles of embryonic development, tracing how complex organisms emerged from simple beginnings through processes of growth and differentiation. He analyzed the relationships between form and function, showing how the structures of different organisms were adapted to their particular ways of life. The political research conducted at the Lyceum was equally systematic and influential. Aristotle and his students collected and analyzed the constitutions of over 150 different Greek city-states, documenting their governmental structures, legal systems, and historical development. This was not merely academic exercise, but practical investigation designed to understand what made political communities successful or unsuccessful, stable or prone to revolution. The results of this research were synthesized in Aristotle's Politics, a work that remains one of the most influential analyses of government ever written. Unlike Plato's Republic, which had outlined an ideal city that existed only in theory, Aristotle's Politics examined actual political systems and drew practical conclusions about how they could be improved. He identified three basic types of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, and analysed the conditions under which each could function effectively or degenerate into tyranny, oligarchy, or mob rule. Aristotle's political analysis was grounded in his understanding of human nature as fundamentally social. Human beings, he argued, are political animals who can achieve their full potential only within the context of a well-ordered community. The purpose of government is not merely to maintain order or protect property, but to create conditions in which citizens can develop their capacities for virtue and flourishing. The best constitution is therefore not necessarily the most theoretically perfect, but the one best suited to the particular circumstances and character of a given population. This practical orientation distinguished Aristotle's approach to politics from that of his predecessors and contemporaries. Where Plato had imagined philosopher kings ruling according to perfect knowledge of eternal forms, Aristotle focused on how actual human beings, with mixed motives and limited understanding, could create institutions that promoted the common good. Where some thinkers advocated pure democracy as the expression of popular will, Aristotle warned of the dangers of mob rule and advocated mixed constitutions that balanced different interests and prevented any single group from dominating others. The ethical investigations conducted at the Lyceum were perhaps even more influential than the political research. Aristotle's approach to ethics was characteristically practical, focused not on abstract definitions of good and evil, but on the concrete question of how human beings could live fulfilling lives. His Nicomachean Ethics, probably named after his son Nicomachus, remains one of the most widely read works of moral philosophy ever written. The central insight of Aristotelian ethics is that virtue is not a matter of following rules or achieving some transcendent state of perfection, but of developing excellent character traits that enable a person to flourish as a human being. Virtues like courage, generosity, and justice are not abstract ideals but practical dispositions that must be cultivated through practice and habit. A person becomes virtuous not by studying virtue, but by acting virtuously until virtuous action becomes second nature. This emphasis on practice and habituation led Aristotle to some of his most psychologically acute observations about human development. Children are not born virtuous or vicious, but acquire moral character through the examples they observe and the behaviours that are encouraged or discouraged by their communities. Education in virtue, therefore, cannot be purely intellectual, but must involve the training of emotions and desires, as well as rational reflection. The goal is not to suppress passion in favour of reason, but to achieve a harmonious integration of all aspects of human personality. The concept of the mean, perhaps Aristotle's most famous contribution to ethical theory, illustrates this integrated approach to virtue. Most virtues, he argued, represent a balanced middle ground between extremes of excess and deficiency. Courage is the mean between cowardice, which involves too little confidence in the face of danger, and recklessness, which involves too much. Generosity lies between stinginess and wasteful extravagance. Justice involves giving people what they deserve, neither too much nor too little. Finding the mean is not a matter of mechanical calculation, but requires practical wisdom, the ability to perceive what action is appropriate in particular circumstances. This practical wisdom can only be developed through experience and reflection, which is why Aristotle believed that young people, however intellectually gifted, cannot be fully virtuous until they have had sufficient experience of life to develop mature judgment about complex moral situations. The ultimate goal of virtue, according to Aristotle, is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness but better understood as flourishing or living well. Eudaimonia is not a feeling or temporary state, but a way of being that characterizes a complete life, lived according to virtue. It requires not only excellent character, but also sufficient external goods, health, friendship, and opportunities for meaningful activity. A person can be virtuous in adverse circumstances, but full human flourishing requires favourable conditions that enable virtue to be expressed in action. This understanding of happiness as flourishing rather than pleasure distinguished Aristotle's ethics from both the hedonistic approaches that made pleasure the highest good and the ascetic traditions that viewed all bodily satisfaction with suspicion. Human beings are complex creatures with intellectual, social, and physical dimensions, all of which must be properly developed and integrated for genuine flourishing to occur. The highest form of happiness involves the exercise of our distinctively human capacities for rational thought and virtuous action within the context of meaningful relationships and worthwhile activities. The research conducted at the Lyceum extended far beyond these central areas of biology, politics, and ethics. Aristotle and his collaborators made significant contributions to astronomy, meteorology, psychology, literary criticism, and what we would now call sociology and anthropology. They developed theories about the nature of memory and dreams, the causes of earthquakes and eclipses, the different types of friendship and love, and the essential characteristics of poetry and drama. The Poetics, Aristotle's analysis of tragic drama, introduced concepts that continue to influence literary criticism and artistic theory. His definition of tragedy as an imitation of action that arouses pity and fear and achieves catharsis through the resolution of these emotions provided a framework for understanding how art can serve important psychological and social functions. His analysis of plot structure, character development, and the relationship between form and content established principles that have guided artistic creation for over 2 millennia. The range and depth of these investigations established the Lyceum as the premier centre of learning in the ancient world. Students came not just from Greece, but from Egypt, Asia Minor, and the distant reaches of Alexander's expanding empire. The school became a magnet for anyone serious about understanding the natural world, human behaviour, or the principles of rational inquiry. Its influence spread through the networks of students who carried Aristotelian methods and ideas back to their home cities and established similar institutions modelled on the Lyceum's example. But the school's success also made it vulnerable to the political tensions that were reshaping the Greek world. Aristotle's association with Alexander, now conquering vast territories in Asia and Africa, made him suspect in the eyes of many Athenians who viewed Macedonian expansion as a threat to Greek independence. The philosopher, who had once been welcomed as a brilliant student returning from foreign travels, was increasingly seen as the agent of a foreign power that threatened traditional Greek values and institutions. These suspicions were exacerbated by developments in Alexander's career that strained his relationship with his former teacher. As the young king adapted to ruling diverse populations across his vast empire, he began adopting Persian customs and requiring his subjects to treat him with the kind of divine honours that Greeks traditionally reserved for gods. This evolution toward Oriental despotism conflicted sharply with the principles of moderation and rational governance that Aristotle had tried to instill during their years together at Mysa. The tension came to a head over the case of Callisthenes, Aristotle's nephew, who had accompanied Alexander as the expedition's official historian. When Alexander began requiring his courtiers to perform proskinesis, the Persian practice of prostrating oneself before the king, Callisthenes refused, arguing that such honours were inappropriate for mortal rulers. His principled stand, which clearly reflected the influence of Aristotelian ethics, cost him his life. Alexander had him arrested on charges of treason and executed, sending a clear message about the limits of philosophical influence in his new world order. For Aristotle, the execution of his nephew was both a personal tragedy and a philosophical crisis. The student he had educated to be a virtuous ruler was now behaving like the tyrants Aristotle had criticized in his political writings. The promise of philosophy to improve political life through the education of leaders seemed to have failed in the most spectacular way possible. The gap between theoretical ideals and practical realities had proven wider than even the most pessimistic analysis had suggested. The political situation in Athens was becoming increasingly precarious for anyone associated with Macedonian interests. Anti-Macedonian sentiment was growing as Alexander's conquests continued to drain Greek resources and manpower. The death of prominent Athenians in Alexander's service fueled resentment against those seen as collaborating with foreign oppression. Aristotle's position as head of a major educational institution made him a visible target for those seeking to express their opposition to Macedonian influence. Yet despite these mounting pressures, Aristotle continued his research and teaching with characteristic dedication. The final years of his tenure at the Lyceum were among his most productive, as he worked to complete the systematic presentation of ideas he had been developing for decades. The treatises that emerged from this period would become the foundation texts of Western philosophy and science, works whose influence would extend far beyond anything their author could have imagined. The Metaphysics, perhaps his most challenging and influential work, tackled the fundamental question of what it means for something to exist. Aristotle's analysis of substance, potentiality, and actuality, and the different types of causation, provided a framework for understanding reality that would dominate philosophical thinking for centuries. His critique of Plato's theory of forms was definitive, showing that universal concepts could be explained without positing a separate realm of perfect archetypes. His development of the concept of the unmoved mover as the ultimate source of motion and change in the universe would later be adapted by medieval theologians as a philosophical proof for the existence of God. The Physics examined the nature of motion, time, space, and change with unprecedented systematic rigor. Aristotle's analysis of the conditions necessary for motion, his critique of the concept of void space, and his understanding of time as the measure of change provided the conceptual foundations for scientific thinking about the natural world. Although many of his specific conclusions would later be overturned by modern science, his approach to these problems and the questions he raised continued to guide scientific inquiry long after his answers had been superseded. The logical treatises, later collected under the title Organon or Tool, provided the first systematic analysis of valid reasoning. Aristotle's development of syllogistic logic, his analysis of different types of premises and conclusions, and his identification of logical fallacies created the intellectual tools that would be essential for rigorous thinking in any field. The principles he established would remain the foundation of logical education until the development of modern symbolic logic in the 19th and 20th centuries. As these works neared completion, Aristotle must have been aware that he was creating something unprecedented in the history of human thought. Never before had anyone attempted such a comprehensive and systematic analysis of all the major domains of knowledge. Never had empirical investigation been combined with logical rigor on such a scale. Never had philosophical reflection been so thoroughly grounded in detailed observation of particular phenomena while maintaining focus on the universal principles that made such phenomena intelligible. The achievement was remarkable, not just for its scope but for its integration. Despite covering everything from biology to metaphysics, from ethics to literary criticism, Aristotle's work maintained a consistent methodological approach and a coherent vision of what it meant to understand something rationally. The same principles of careful observation, logical analysis, and systematic classification that guided his study of animal species also informed his investigation of political constitutions, moral virtues, and the nature of being itself. This integration reflected Aristotle's conviction that reality itself was fundamentally rational and therefore accessible to human understanding. Unlike some earlier philosophers who had emphasized the limitations of human knowledge or the unbridgeable gap between appearance and reality, Aristotle believed that patient investigation, using proper methods, could yield genuine insight into how things actually worked. The world was complex and often puzzling, but it was not fundamentally mysterious or beyond the reach of careful inquiry. This optimism about human cognitive abilities would prove to be one of Aristotle's most influential legacies. His confidence that systematic investigation could reveal truth about every aspect of reality provided the intellectual foundation for the scientific revolution that would transform human understanding centuries later. His belief that rational analysis could guide practical decision-making in ethics and politics influenced the development of moral philosophy and political theory throughout the Western tradition. But even as Aristotle was completing his life's work, events beyond his control were moving toward a crisis that would force him once again into exile from the city he had come to love. In 323 BC, news arrived that would change everything. Alexander the Great, conqueror of most of the known world and the most powerful individual in human history, was dead at the age of 32 in distant Babylon. The empire he had created was already beginning to fragment as his generals competed for control of different territories. For Athens, Alexander's death represented an opportunity to reassert independence from Macedonian control. Anti-Macedonian sentiment, long suppressed by fear of Alexander's power, erupted into open rebellion. The Lamian War began as Athens and other Greek cities attempted to throw off the foreign domination that had constrained their freedom for decades. For Aristotle, the political transformation was potentially catastrophic. His association with Alexander, his Macedonian origins, and his position as head of a major educational institution made him an obvious target for Athenian anger against everything connected to foreign rule. The charges that were soon brought against him were ominously familiar, almost identical to those that had been used against Socrates over 70 years earlier. Impiety toward the gods of Athens and corrupting the youth of the city. The parallel was deliberate and threatening. Everyone remembered what had happened to Socrates when he had been convicted on similar charges. The philosopher, who had spent decades contributing to Athenian intellectual life through his teaching and research, was now being treated as an enemy of the city whose knowledge and methods he had helped to advance. Faced with the choice between staying to defend himself in court or leaving Athens to avoid the fate of his predecessor, Aristotle made a decision that revealed both his practical wisdom and his commitment to the philosophical life he had spent decades building. Unlike Socrates, who had chosen to remain and accept whatever judgment the city imposed, Aristotle chose exile. According to later tradition, he explained this decision by saying he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy. In 322 BC, at the age of 62, Aristotle left Athens for the final time, taking with him the manuscripts and research materials that represented the work of a lifetime. His destination was Chalcis, on the island of Euboea, where his mother's family had property and where he could find refuge from the political turmoil that was consuming the Greek world. The school he had built over 13 years, the institution that had become the most important centre of learning in the Mediterranean world, was left in the capable hands of Theophrastus, his most devoted student and collaborator. The exile was brief but symbolically significant. The philosopher who had attempted to understand every aspect of human experience, who had created the intellectual tools that would guide rational inquiry for millennia, had been rejected by the very city that had benefited most from his contributions. The tension between philosophical investigation and political loyalty, between the pursuit of truth and the demands of civic solidarity, had proven irreconcilable in ways that foreshadowed conflicts that would persist throughout the history of intellectual life. Less than a year after his arrival in Chalcis, Aristotle died of a stomach ailment that had troubled him for years. He was 62 years old, having lived long enough to complete the systematic presentation of his revolutionary approach to knowledge, but not long enough to see how profoundly his ideas would transform human understanding. His will, preserved by ancient biographers, reveals a man who remained devoted to his family and students, even in his final moments, providing for the care of his dependents and the continuation of his philosophical work. The death of Aristotle marks the end of the most productive period in the history of ancient philosophy, the century and a half that had seen the work of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle establish the intellectual foundations of Western civilization. But it also marks the beginning of an influence that would extend far beyond anything achieved by previous thinkers. The systematic and comprehensive character of Aristotle's work, combined with its integration of empirical observation and logical analysis, provided resources that would be drawn upon by every subsequent generation of philosophers, scientists, and scholars. The immediate future of Aristotelian philosophy was secured by the loyalty and competence of Theophrastus, who continued to lead the Lyceum for 36 years after his teacher's death. Under his guidance, the school maintained its commitment to empirical research and systematic investigation, making important contributions to botany, mineralogy, and other natural sciences. The methods and approaches Aristotle had developed were refined and extended by students who carried on the tradition of collaborative investigation that had made the Lyceum the premier research institution of the ancient world. But the ultimate measure of Aristotle's achievement would not be found in the continuation of his school, or even in the preservation of his writings. It would be found in the transformation of human thinking that his work had made possible, a transformation whose full implications would only become apparent over the centuries that followed his death. The boy from Stagira, who had arrived in Athens with nothing but curiosity and determination, had created the intellectual framework that would guide human inquiry into every aspect of reality, from the smallest details of animal behaviour to the largest questions about the nature of existence itself. But even as Theophrastus worked to preserve the institutional legacy of the Lyceum, the intellectual revolution Aristotle had initiated was already spreading far beyond the gardens where he had once walked with his students. The systematic approach to knowledge he had developed, the logical tools he had created, and the comprehensive vision of reality he had articulated were being carried across the Mediterranean world by students who had absorbed not just his specific conclusions, but his methods of investigation. The conquests of Alexander, ironically, had created the perfect conditions for the dissemination of Aristotelian thought. The vast cosmopolitan empire that stretched from Egypt to India provided networks of communication and exchange that allowed ideas to travel with unprecedented speed and reach. Greek became the common language of educated discourse across this enormous territory, and the intellectual frameworks developed at the Lyceum became the standard tools for anyone seeking to understand the natural world or organize human knowledge systematically. In Alexandria, the great library and research center established by the Ptolemies became a repository for Aristotelian texts and a training ground for scholars who applied his methods to new domains of investigation. The physicians who worked there used his logical principles to organize medical knowledge and develop more effective treatments. The astronomers employed his techniques of systematic observation to map the movements of celestial bodies with greater precision than had ever been achieved. The mathematicians built upon his understanding of definition and demonstration to create more rigorous proofs and explore new areas of mathematical inquiry. The influence extended beyond the sciences to every area of human inquiry. Historians adopted Aristotelian methods of evidence evaluation and causal analysis to create more accurate and systematic accounts of past events. Rhetoricians used his logical principles to construct more persuasive arguments and identify the fallacies that weakened their opponents' cases. Even artists and craftsmen found that his analysis of form and function provided valuable insights into the principles that made their work effective and beautiful. This practical application of Aristotelian ideas was facilitated by the extraordinary pedagogical clarity of his mature works. Unlike many philosophical texts that remained accessible only to specialists, Aristotle's treatises were designed to serve as teaching tools that could transmit complex ideas to students with varying levels of preparation. His systematic approach to definition, his careful progression from basic principles to advanced applications, and his use of concrete examples to illustrate abstract concepts made his work uniquely suitable for educational purposes. The logical treatises proved particularly influential in this regard. The principles of syllogistic reasoning that Aristotle had developed could be learned by anyone willing to work through his systematic presentation, and once mastered, these tools could be applied to virtually any domain where reliable conclusions needed to be drawn from available evidence. Students who might never engage seriously with his metaphysical or ethical theories could still benefit enormously from learning to think more clearly about the relationships between premises and conclusions in their own fields of interest. This widespread adoption of Aristotelian methods created what might be called the first truly scientific culture in human history. For the first time, large numbers of people across diverse fields were employing similar approaches to investigation and analysis. They shared common standards for what counted as evidence, similar expectations about the relationship between observation and theory, and comparable techniques for organizing and communicating their findings. The intellectual fragmentation that had characterized earlier periods, when different schools of thought operated according to incompatible assumptions and methods, began to give way to a more unified approach to the pursuit of knowledge. The transformation was not merely technical, but cultural and psychological. The confidence that systematic investigation could yield reliable knowledge about any aspect of reality encouraged intellectual ambition on an unprecedented scale. Scholars began to envision comprehensive mappings of entire domains of knowledge, systematic classifications that would organize everything known about particular subjects, and theoretical frameworks that could unify apparently disparate phenomena under common principles. This optimism about human cognitive abilities was reinforced by the practical successes that Aristotelian methods were producing. Engineers used his principles of mechanical analysis to design more effective machines and construct more durable buildings. Agricultural specialists employed his biological insights to develop better techniques for crop cultivation and animal husbandry. Military commanders applied his strategic thinking to achieve more decisive victories with fewer casualties. The abstract philosophical investigations conducted at the Lyceum were proving their value in the most practical possible ways, but perhaps the most profound impact of Aristotelian thought was on the development of human personality and character. His ethical writings provided a framework for thinking about virtue and flourishing that was both psychologically sophisticated and practically applicable. Unlike moral systems that demanded adherence to abstract rules or the suppression of natural desires, Aristotelian ethics offered a path toward human excellence that integrated reason and emotion, individual fulfillment and social responsibility, theoretical understanding and practical wisdom. The concept of virtue as habit proved particularly influential in shaping educational practices and personal development. Parents and teachers began to understand that moral character was not fixed at birth, but could be cultivated through careful attention to the examples children observed and the behaviours that were encouraged or discouraged in their daily lives. This insight led to more thoughtful approaches to child rearing and more systematic programs of moral education that aimed at developing practical wisdom rather than mere rule following. The analysis of friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics provided equally valuable guidance for understanding and improving human relationships. Aristotle's distinction between friendships based on utility, pleasure, and virtue helped people recognize the different types of connections they formed with others and understand what was required to develop and maintain relationships of the highest quality. His insight that the best friendships involve mutual recognition of each other's excellence and shared commitment to virtuous activity offered a vision of human community that was both demanding and deeply satisfying. The political implications of Aristotelian thought were equally far-reaching, though more complex and sometimes contradictory in their effects. His analysis of different constitutional forms and his emphasis on the importance of the rule of law provided intellectual resources for those seeking to create more just and stable forms of government. The idea that political institutions should serve the common good rather than the narrow interests of particular groups became a standard by which actual governments could be evaluated and criticized. At the same time, his defense of slavery and his assumption that some forms of natural inequality were legitimate provided justification for practices and attitudes that would later be recognized as fundamentally unjust. The tension between his commitment to rational inquiry and his acceptance of conventional social arrangements revealed the limitations that even the most systematic thinking could face when confronting deeply embedded cultural assumptions. These contradictions would become more apparent as Aristotelian ideas spread to different cultural contexts and were adapted to serve various political purposes. Roman administrators used his classification of governmental forms to analyze the constitutional arrangements of conquered territories and design more effective systems of imperial control. Christian theologians employed his logical methods to develop more sophisticated defenses of religious doctrine, while sometimes rejecting his conclusions about the eternity of the world or the mortality of the soul. The encounter between Aristotelian philosophy and emerging Christianity proved particularly fruitful and complex. Early Christian thinkers found his logical tools invaluable for defending their beliefs against pagan critics and for developing more systematic presentations of Christian doctrine. His emphasis on the importance of virtue and his analysis of the conditions for human flourishing resonated with Christian concerns about moral development and spiritual growth. But significant tensions also emerged. Aristotle's confidence in human reason seemed to diminish the importance of divine revelation, while his focus on earthly flourishing appeared to undervalue the transcendent destiny that Christianity promised. His acceptance of the eternity of the world conflicted with the biblical account of creation, and his understanding of the soul's relationship to the body raised questions about the possibility of resurrection. These tensions would not be fully resolved until the medieval period, when thinkers like Thomas Aquinas developed sophisticated syntheses that preserved what they saw as the valid insights of Aristotelian philosophy while correcting its errors through appeal to revealed truth. But even in the early centuries after his death, the engagement between Aristotelian and Christian thought was producing new insights and approaches that neither tradition could have achieved in isolation. The preservation and transmission of Aristotelian texts during this period was itself a remarkable achievement that required the dedication of successive generations of scholars and scribes. Unlike modern printed books that can be reproduced easily and preserved indefinitely, ancient manuscripts were vulnerable to fire, flood, war, and simple decay. The survival of Aristotle's major works required continuous efforts by people who recognized their value and were willing to invest the time and resources necessary to copy them accurately and store them safely. The story of this preservation process reveals both the precarious nature of intellectual inheritance and the power of ideas to inspire protective devotion across centuries and cultures. When political upheavals threatened the libraries where Aristotelian texts were housed, scholars risked their lives to save manuscripts that they regarded as irreplaceable treasures. When economic difficulties made it impossible to maintain institutional libraries, private individuals used their own resources to preserve works they considered essential for human knowledge. The transmission process also involved translation into different languages as Aristotelian ideas spread beyond the Greek-speaking world. Arabic scholars played a particularly crucial role in this process, not only preserving Greek texts that might otherwise have been lost, but also developing commentaries and extensions that enriched understanding of Aristotelian principles. Their work would later prove essential when Western European scholars began to rediscover Aristotelian philosophy in the medieval period. But preservation and transmission were not merely passive processes of copying and storage. Each generation of scholars who engaged with Aristotelian texts also interpreted them, applied them to new problems, and developed them in directions that reflected their own intellectual concerns and cultural contexts. The living tradition of Aristotelian thought was thus constantly evolving, even as it remained grounded in the systematic investigations that had been conducted at the Lyceum centuries earlier. This dynamic relationship between tradition and innovation would prove to be one of the most important aspects of Aristotelian influence. Rather than fossilizing into a rigid orthodoxy, Aristotelian philosophy remained flexible enough to accommodate new discoveries and insights while providing stable methodological principles that could guide investigation across different domains and historical periods. The frameworks Aristotle had developed were sufficiently general to be applicable to problems he had never considered, yet sufficiently specific to provide genuine guidance for those who mastered their proper use. The mathematical and scientific investigations that flourished in the Hellenistic period exemplified this productive relationship between Aristotelian methods and innovative research. Scholars like Euclid in mathematics and Archimedes in physics employed logical principles that derived ultimately from Aristotelian analysis while making discoveries that extended far beyond anything Aristotle himself had achieved. Their work demonstrated that the tools he had created were capable of supporting intellectual advances that even their inventor had not anticipated. Similarly, the medical and biological research that continued at Alexandria and other centers of learning built upon Aristotelian foundations, while correcting and extending his specific conclusions about anatomical structures and physiological processes. The systematic approach to observation and classification that he had pioneered proved more valuable than any particular theory he had proposed, providing a methodological framework that could accommodate new evidence and support more accurate understanding of natural phenomena. This pattern of methodological continuity, combined with theoretical development, would characterize the influence of Aristotelian thought throughout subsequent centuries. Even when specific Aristotelian doctrines were abandoned or revised, the underlying approach to investigation that he had developed continued to shape how serious thinkers approach complex problems. His greatest contribution was not any particular set of conclusions, but the demonstration that systematic rational inquiry could yield reliable knowledge about every aspect of reality. The educational institutions that emerged throughout the Hellenistic world reflected this understanding of Aristotelian influence. Rather than simply teaching students to memorize and repeat the master's conclusions, these schools emphasized the development of analytical skills and investigative methods that students could apply to their own areas of interest. The goal was not to produce disciples who would defend predetermined doctrines, but to train independent thinkers who could extend human knowledge through their own original research. This educational philosophy had profound implications for the development of human civilization. For the first time in history, large numbers of people were being systematically trained in methods of rational inquiry that enabled them to make genuine contributions to human knowledge. The intellectual advances that had previously been confined to a few exceptional individuals were becoming more widely distributed across entire populations of educated people. The cumulative effect of this democratization of rational method was an acceleration in the pace of human learning that would continue for centuries. Each generation could build more effectively upon the achievements of its predecessors, because more people possessed the tools necessary to understand, evaluate, and extend existing knowledge. The systematic approach to investigation that Aristotle had developed at the Lyceum was becoming the foundation for a truly progressive intellectual culture. But this influence extended beyond the formal educational institutions to affect every aspect of social and economic life. Craftsmen who learned to apply Aristotelian principles of analysis to their work became more skilled at solving technical problems and developing improved techniques. Merchants who understood his logical methods became more effective at evaluating opportunities and managing complex transactions. Even ordinary citizens who absorbed elements of Aristotelian thinking through popular education became more capable of participating effectively in public deliberations about community policies and decisions. The transformation was gradual but comprehensive, creating changes in human capacity and aspiration that would have seemed almost miraculous to earlier generations. The boy from Stagira who had walked through the gates of Athens, carrying nothing but curiosity and determination, had initiated a revolution in human thinking, whose effects would continue to unfold long after his death. His vision of systematic rational inquiry as the key to understanding reality had proven powerful enough to reshape entire civilizations and create new possibilities for human achievement that previous ages could never have imagined. As the Hellenistic period gave way to Roman dominance, these Aristotelian influences would encounter new challenges and opportunities that would test their adaptability and reveal new dimensions of their potential. The practical Roman temperament would find different uses for Aristotelian insights than the more theoretical Greek approach had emphasized, while the growing influence of Christianity would raise fundamental questions about the relationship between reason and revelation that would require creative new syntheses. but the foundations had been laid for intellectual developments that would continue to transform human understanding for millennia to come. The Roman conquest of Greece in the 2nd century BC might have seemed like the end of Hellenic intellectual achievement, but it proved instead to be the beginning of an extraordinary new chapter in the story of Aristotelian influence. The practical Romans, initially suspicious of Greek philosophy as an effeminate distraction from the serious business of conquest and administration, gradually discovered that Aristotelian methods offered precisely the tools they needed to govern their vast and diverse empire effectively. Marcus Tullius Cicero exemplified this Roman appropriation of Greek wisdom. As a young man studying rhetoric in Athens and Rhodes, he encountered Aristotelian logic and ethical theory through teachers who traced their intellectual lineage directly back to the Lyceum. But Cicero was not content to remain a passive student of foreign philosophy. He recognized that Aristotelian insights could be adapted to serve distinctly Roman purposes, providing intellectual foundations for the legal and political institutions that held the empire together. Cicero's forensic speeches demonstrate Aristotelian influence in action. The careful analysis of evidence, the systematic refutation of opposing arguments, and the strategic appeal to different types of proof that characterized his courtroom performances all reflected principles he had learned from studying the logical treatises, but he applied these methods to serve Roman justice rather than abstract philosophical inquiry, showing how Aristotelian tools could enhance practical effectiveness in ways their creator had never explicitly envisioned. More significantly, Cicero undertook the massive project of translating Greek philosophical vocabulary into Latin, creating the conceptual language that would make Aristotelian ideas accessible to Roman audiences. Terms like substantia, qualitas, and relatio became the Latin equivalents of Aristotelian technical concepts, allowing Roman thinkers to engage with sophisticated philosophical problems using their own linguistic resources. This translation project was not merely linguistic, but cultural, adapting Greek theoretical frameworks to serve Roman practical concerns. The influence extended throughout Roman educational practice. The traditional Roman emphasis on rhetoric and oratory was enriched by Aristotelian insights into the nature of persuasion and the structure of effective argument. Young Romans preparing for careers in law, politics, or military command learned to organize their thinking according to logical principles that enhanced their ability to analyze complex problems and communicate their conclusions persuasively. Roman historians like Livy and Tacitus employed Aristotelian methods of causal analysis to understand the rise and fall of political institutions. Their narratives were not mere chronicles of events, but systematic investigations into the factors that made some policies successful and others disastrous. The psychological insights that Aristotle had developed in his ethical writings proved particularly valuable for understanding the motivations of historical actors and the consequences of their choices. The Roman legal system itself was transformed by the application of Aristotelian principles to jurisprudence. The systematic classification of different types of legal relationships, the careful analysis of the conditions that made contracts valid or invalid, and the development of general principles that could guide judicial decisions in novel cases all reflected the influence of methods that had originated in the Lyceum centuries earlier. Roman engineers and architects found Aristotelian insights equally valuable for their practical projects. The analysis of mechanical principles that govern the operation of machines, the understanding of structural relationships that determine the stability of buildings, and the systematic approach to problem solving that characterized major construction projects all demonstrated the continued relevance of theoretical investigations that had begun with the study of animal locomotion and plant growth. But perhaps the most profound Roman contribution to Aristotelian tradition was the development of comprehensive legal and administrative systems that embodied philosophical principles on an unprecedented scale. The Roman legal code represented an attempt to organize all aspects of human relationships according to rational principles that could be applied consistently across different cultural contexts. The administrative practices that governed provincial territories reflected systematic thinking about the conditions necessary for stable and just government. These institutional achievements demonstrated that Aristotelian insights could be more than academic exercises or personal guides to virtue. They could serve as foundations for social and political arrangements that shaped the lives of millions of people across vast geographical areas. The boy from Stagira who had wondered about the nature of justice and the conditions for human flourishing could never have imagined that his investigations would eventually influence the legal systems that governed territories from Britain to Egypt. The encounter between Aristotelian philosophy and Roman Christianity in the later imperial period created even more complex and far-reaching developments. Early Christian apologists like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria had already begun to explore the relationship between Greek philosophical insights and Christian revelation, but it was Augustine of Hippo who achieved the most influential synthesis of these traditions. Augustine's intellectual journey recapitulated, in compressed form, the entire development of ancient philosophy. Raised in North Africa during the 4th century, he was educated in classical rhetoric and initially attracted to Manichaean dualism, before encountering Neoplatonic philosophy and finally converting to Christianity. His mature theological system drew heavily on Aristotelian logical methods while subordinating philosophical reasoning to the authority of revealed truth. The Confessions, Augustine's spiritual autobiography, demonstrates Aristotelian influence in its systematic analysis of psychological development and its careful attention to the relationship between rational understanding and emotional commitment. His account of his own conversion employs the same methodical approach to understanding human motivation that Aristotle had used in analyzing ethical development, but applies it to the specific problem of explaining how divine grace operates through human psychology. Augustine's City of God represents an even more ambitious application of Aristotelian methods to Christian concerns. His analysis of different forms of political association, his investigation of the relationship between temporal and eternal values, and his systematic refutation of pagan philosophical and religious claims all reflect the influence of techniques he had learned from studying Aristotelian texts. But he employed these methods to defend and explain a worldview that differed fundamentally from anything Aristotle had imagined. This creative appropriation of Aristotelian methods for non-Aristotelian purposes became characteristic of Christian intellectual development throughout the later Roman period and beyond. Thinkers like Boethius, who translated and commented on Aristotelian logical texts while developing distinctively Christian approaches to philosophical problems, demonstrated that the analytical tools Aristotle had created could serve intellectual projects he had never contemplated. The barbarian invasions that eventually brought down the Western Roman Empire created new challenges and opportunities for the preservation and development of Aristotelian thought. As urban centres declined and institutional libraries were destroyed, the survival of classical texts depended increasingly on the dedication of individual scholars and the protective efforts of Christian monasteries. The monks who copied manuscripts in isolated scriptoriums were not motivated by academic interest in ancient philosophy, but by religious conviction about the importance of preserving all forms of human knowledge. This monastic preservation effort was itself influenced by Aristotelian ideas about the systematic organization of knowledge. The great libraries that developed at monasteries like Monte Cassino and St. Gall employed classification systems that reflected principles Aristotle had developed for organizing the contents of the Lyceum library. The educational curricula that emerged in monastic schools were structured according to logical sequences that moved from basic skills to advanced theoretical understanding in ways that echoed Aristotelian pedagogical methods. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Roman Empire, the tradition of Aristotelian scholarship continued with less interruption. The schools of Athens and Alexandria maintained their commitment to philosophical education until the 6th century, when the Emperor Justinian's closure of pagan educational institutions forced the migration of scholars to other centres of learning. But the intellectual networks that had developed over centuries of Aristotelian influence proved remarkably resilient, adapting to new political and cultural circumstances while preserving essential elements of the tradition. The rise of Islam in the 7th century created an entirely new context for the transmission and development of Aristotelian thought. Arab conquerors who overran the territories of the former Byzantine and Persian empires encountered libraries containing Greek philosophical texts that had been preserved by Christian and Persian scholars. Initially, these texts were valued primarily for their practical applications in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics, but gradually, Islamic intellectuals began to recognize the broader significance of Aristotelian philosophical methods. The translation movement that flourished in Baghdad during the 8th and 9th centuries represented one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements in human history. Scholars working under the patronage of the Abbasid caliphs systematically translated Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, creating a new philosophical vocabulary that made Aristotelian ideas accessible to Islamic civilization. Translators like Hunayn ibn Ishaq and his assistants were not merely rendering Greek words into Arabic equivalents, but were developing conceptual frameworks that allowed Islamic thinkers to engage with sophisticated philosophical problems using their own cultural resources. The Islamic appropriation of Aristotelian philosophy was even more creative and transformative than the earlier Roman adaptation had been. Thinkers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, developed original philosophical systems that employed Aristotelian methods while addressing distinctly Islamic concerns about the relationship between reason and revelation, the nature of prophetic knowledge, and the possibility of mystical experience. Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, produced the most systematic and influential commentaries on Aristotelian texts ever written. His detailed analyses of the logical, physical, and metaphysical treatises demonstrated levels of philosophical sophistication that surpassed anything achieved by earlier interpreters. But he was not merely an expositor of ancient doctrine. His commentaries developed original insights that extended Aristotelian principles in new directions and addressed problems that the original texts had left unresolved. The Islamic development of Aristotelian thought was particularly significant in the areas of natural philosophy and scientific method. Scholars like Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazan, employed Aristotelian logical principles to develop experimental methods that anticipated later European scientific innovations. Their investigations of optics, mechanics, and astronomy demonstrated that systematic empirical inquiry, guided by rational analysis, could yield genuine discoveries about the natural world. Islamic mathematicians like al-Khwarizmi and al-Battani used Aristotelian approaches to classification and demonstration to organize mathematical knowledge more systematically than had ever been achieved. Their work on algebra and trigonometry employed logical methods that derived ultimately from the Lyceum, while making original contributions that extended far beyond anything Greek mathematicians had accomplished. The medical tradition that flourished in Islamic civilization represented another domain where Aristotelian influence proved remarkably fruitful. Physicians like Al-Razi and Ibn Sina applied systematic observational methods to understand disease processes and develop more effective treatments. Their comprehensive medical texts organized vast amounts of empirical knowledge according to rational principles that enabled more accurate diagnosis and more successful therapy. But perhaps the most profound Islamic contribution to Aristotelian tradition was the development of sophisticated philosophical theologies that attempted to reconcile rational inquiry with religious revelation. Islamic thinkers faced essentially the same problem that Christian theologians confronted, but they approached it with different cultural resources and intellectual priorities. Their solutions often differed from Christian approaches, but they demonstrated the continued vitality of Aristotelian methods for addressing the most fundamental questions about the relationship between human reason and divine truth. The influence of Islamic Aristotelianism extended far beyond the boundaries of Islamic civilization itself. The Crusades and the expansion of trade networks created opportunities for intellectual exchange between Islamic and Christian scholars that proved enormously productive for both traditions. European students who traveled to centers of Islamic learning in Spain and Sicily encountered sophisticated philosophical texts and methods that had been lost to Western Europe for centuries. The rediscovery of Aristotelian philosophy in medieval Europe through Arabic sources represented a watershed moment in the development of Western thought. When scholars like Gerard of Cremona and Michael Scott began translating Arabic commentaries on Aristotelian texts into Latin, they were not simply recovering ancient Greek philosophy. They were introducing European intellectuals to highly developed Islamic interpretations and extensions of Aristotelian principles that had evolved over centuries of creative engagement with philosophical problems. This encounter between Islamic and Christian Aristotelianism created intellectual ferment that would transform European civilization in ways that neither tradition could have achieved independently. The universities that emerged in Paris, Oxford, Bologna, and other European centres during the 12th and 13th centuries were designed explicitly to accommodate the systematic study of philosophical and theological questions that this encounter had made newly urgent and intellectually exciting. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of the medieval scholastic philosophers, exemplified the synthetic approach that characterized this period. His systematic theology employed Aristotelian logical methods and metaphysical principles while maintaining fundamental commitments to Christian doctrine that sometimes required significant modifications of Aristotelian conclusions. His achievement was not simply to reconcile reason and revelation, but to demonstrate that each could enhance and strengthen the other when properly understood. From the mountains of Macedonia to the streets of medieval Europe, from the shores of ancient Greece to the libraries of Baghdad, Aristotle's influence flows like an underground river through the foundations of human civilization. The curious teenager who walked through Athens' gates carrying nothing but questions transformed not just philosophy, but the very way we think about thinking itself. His fingerprints remain on every domain of knowledge, from the scientific method that guides modern research to the ethical frameworks that shape our understanding of virtue and flourishing. Today, whenever we classify information, construct logical arguments, or seek to understand the natural world through systematic observation, we are walking in the footsteps of the boy from Stagira, who dared to believe that human reason could illuminate every corner of reality.